If only they knew why his friend shot off his thumb. It saved him from being sacrificed in the jungle. The drums started at midnight. I heard them before I saw anything. Deep, rolling sounds that moved through the trees like a second heartbeat, pressing against my chest from the outside. My wrists were bound behind me with thick rope twisted from jungle vines, and my back was flat against a tree so wide that 3 men could not wrap their arms around it. The bark was rough and cold. Above me, strange carvings had been cut into the wood. Shapes I did not understand but somehow feared, symbols that looked older than the village, older than memory itself. I could smell smoke and something else, something sweeter, like herbs burning over a slow fire. They moved around me in a wide circle. Tall figures walking upright on 2 legs, shaped like men but not men. Their shoulders were broader, their arms longer, their faces hidden beneath masks made of bark and dried leaves. They did not speak. They only moved, stepping in rhythm with the drums, their feet pressing the earth in perfect silence despite their size. A priest separated from the circle. He was taller than the rest, wearing a long cloth the color of ash. He walked toward me slowly. I did not scream. I told myself what I always told myself when things went wrong. It's all good. The priest raised one hand to stop the drums. He leaned forward and began inspecting my body with careful, deliberate eyes. I held still. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. His gaze moved from my face to my arms, down to my hands. Then he stopped. He lifted my left hand and stared at where my thumb used to be. The drums fell completely silent. Something was wrong with me. 3 days before that night, I was dragged through the center of our village in broad daylight. My name is Kofi. I am not a warrior or an elder or a man of great wealth. I farm a small plot near the eastern edge of the village. I fish the river twice a week, and I keep to myself more than most people here are comfortable with. I notice things. That has always been my curse. They dragged me by my arms through the red dirt, past the market stalls and the cooking fires and the women who turned their eyes away. Children watched from doorways. Old men sat with their hands folded and said nothing. The ropes cut into my skin. I did not fight them. Chief Abora stood at the center of the square with his walking staff planted in the ground like a flag. He looked tired. He looked like a man doing something he had already half decided was wrong but could not stop. The herbalist stood just behind him and to the left. His name was Duro. He was not from our village. He had arrived only weeks before, carrying a leather satchel full of roots and charms and promises. He watched me being dragged through the dirt with his hands folded in front of him and his face showing nothing at all. The chief declared me the offering. Even he looked uneasy saying it. I looked straight at Duro. He did not blink. I said quietly, for no one in particular, "It's all good." It began the way most disasters begin, with something that looked like a gift. Duro arrived on a Tuesday morning, walking into the village from the western road, the one that connected us to the outer bush. He carried his satchel over one shoulder and walked with the easy confidence of a man who had been welcomed in many places before. He was tall, with sharp eyes and a warm smile, and he spoke in the kind of voice that makes you feel like you have known someone for years even when you just met them. He said he was a traveling herbalist, moving from village to village offering protective charms and healing medicines. He said he had cured sleeping sickness in the north and helped a drought village find water using root divination. He said his charms could keep evil spirits at the boundary of any settlement that welcomed him properly. The elders listened. Then they argued. Then they welcomed him. That same week, 3 of our cattle that had been slowly dying of a wasting sickness suddenly recovered. 2 more that had been expected to die before the rains came were walking normally by the end of the week. Everyone called it remarkable. I noticed that the forest had gone strangely quiet in those same days. The birds that usually sang from the treeline at dusk stopped singing. Nobody else seemed to notice that part. Within 2 weeks, Duro had become the most popular man in the village. Farmers who had worn his charms, small bundles of twisted cord and dry herbs tied at the wrist, began reporting better harvests than they had seen in years. Yams came up fat and clean. The maize stalks stood tall without the usual yellowing that came with the dry season heat. Women who had struggled with sick children said their little ones were sleeping through the night again without fevers. People began calling him a blessing from the ancestors. Chief Abora gave him a clean hut near the center of the village and invited him to sit in on council meetings. Old women brought him food without being asked. He accepted all of it graciously and quietly, never boasting, never demanding more than he was offered. That humility made people trust him even faster. I watched all of this carefully. I am not a jealous man. I had no reason to dislike Duro simply because the village loved him. But I started noticing the hunters coming back from the bush with less and less game. Animals that had always grazed near the forest edge were now nowhere to be seen. The hunters said the creatures were retreating deeper into the jungle than they had ever gone before. One hunter told me he felt watched from the treeline. He laughed when he said it, but his eyes did not laugh. I found the first marking on a Tuesday morning, near the place where the forest begins and the farmland ends. A dead goat lay on its side in the tall grass, half hidden by a fallen branch. It was one of the village goats. I recognized the notch cut into its left ear. It had not been killed by any predator I could identify. There were no bite marks, no signs of struggle. It simply lay there like it had been placed, arranged even, with its legs tucked neatly beneath it. But what stopped me was what had been burned into its skin. Along the length of its side, pressed into the fur with something hot, were markings. Symbols arranged in a careful pattern, circles inside circles, with lines cutting across them at angles that looked deliberate, mathematical almost. The ash was still faintly warm when I pressed my fingers against it. I had never seen those symbols before in my life. I brought the goat to the elders' meeting that afternoon and laid it in front of the council. Duro was there, sitting to the chief's right. He looked at the goat, then at the markings, and his expression remained perfectly calm. He said it was ancestral protection burned into the animal's skin to keep illness away. He said it was an old practice from the northern villages and meant no harm at all. The elders nodded and moved on. That night, 3 children in the village had the same dream. The children described it independently. Their parents only discovered this when they mentioned it at the water well the next morning and realized the details matched perfectly. In the dream, they were each standing at the edge of the jungle at nighttime. The forest was dark, but they could see a line of figures between the trees. Tall shapes standing completely still, watching the village. The figures had eyes that caught the moonlight like animals, glowing faintly red in the dark. The children said the figures were not moving, just watching. One child said he tried to run back to the village, but his legs would not work. He stood there, frozen, while the figures counted him. That was the word he used, counted. I heard this story from my neighbor and felt the cold move down my spine. I went back to the elders the same afternoon with both pieces, the marked goat and now the matching dreams from children who had never spoken to each other about it. I laid it out carefully, calmly, the way I always try to present things so that people will actually hear me. The eldest elder laughed first. Then the others followed. The chief told me kindly that fear had a way of making patterns where none existed. He said I was a good man, but perhaps I spent too much time alone, and that the forest had always held mysteries that simple men were not meant to understand. I walked home with my jaw tight. 3 days after the elders' meeting, Emre shot off my thumb. Emre is my closest friend. We grew up together, fished the same stretch of river as boys, and built our homes on neighboring plots. He is not a careless man. He is one of the best hunters in the village. Steady hands, patient eyes, slow trigger. An accident from Emre was the last thing anyone expected. We had gone into the outer bush together that morning, just the 2 of us, tracking a bushbuck that had been spotted near the western ridge. We had been following the trail for nearly an hour when we startled a large bird from the undergrowth. Emre swung his hunting bow fast, the way he always did when something moved unexpectedly, and fired without fully looking. The arrow caught the edge of my left hand and took my thumb clean off at the base. The pain arrived a half-second after the sound. I looked down at my hand, then at the blood, then at Emre's face, which had gone the color of ash. He kept saying my name. He kept saying he was sorry. I pressed the wound against my cloth and said the only thing I knew how to say. "It's all good, Emre. It's all good." He wrapped my hand tightly in cloth strips and guided me back to the village. We did not notice Duro approaching us at the gate until he was already there, asking about the wound with that calm, careful voice of his. He asked, very quietly, if he could keep the severed piece. He said it was for a healing remedy, something about controlling infection. Emre looked at me. I looked at Duro. I said nothing. 5 days after my thumb, a sacred goat vanished from the shrine. This was not an ordinary goat. The shrine animals were set apart from the village's livestock specifically because they were considered untouchable, protected by ancestral law and watched over by the shrine keeper, an old man named Yawa who had held that position for 30 years. Nothing had been taken from that shrine in living memory. When Yawa discovered the animal missing at dawn, he woke the entire village with his shouting. By the time the sun was fully up, everyone had gathered at the shrine. The rope that had secured the goat was not cut. It was untied, which meant hands had been involved. Careful, patient hands. There were no tracks leading away from the shrine. Nothing disturbed in the surrounding dust except for a single straight line drawn in the dirt, pointing toward the forest. Panic moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Duro stepped forward before the elders could speak. He said the forest spirits were restless. He said they had been patient for weeks, waiting for the village to recognize what was disturbing the balance. He said that whatever was taking the animals and troubling the children's sleep would only grow stronger unless the village made an offering to settle the jungle's anger. He said this quietly, like a man sharing sad news he wished he did not have to share. Everyone listened. I watched his face while he spoke and felt something cold settle into my chest. 2 days after the goat vanished, they blamed me. I still do not fully understand how it happened so quickly. One morning I was a concerned man trying to warn people. By evening I was the suspected cause of all of it. Somewhere between those 2 points, a story had been built about me, brick by brick, that I did not have a chance to argue against. The story went like this. I had been entering the jungle too often and without the proper rituals. I had disturbed the spirits with my wandering. My dismissal of Duro's medicines and my questioning of the elders showed disrespect for the old ways. Even the accident with my thumb was framed as a warning that I had already received, a sign from above that I was walking a dangerous path. I was called to stand before the council. I stood there with my wrapped hand held at my side and I told them everything again. The ash markings on the goat, the matching symbols near the shrine tree, the children's dreams, the way animals retreated from the forest edge when Duro arrived, the way he asked for my severed thumb. I laid it all out in clear, simple language. They looked at me the way people look at someone who is speaking a language they have decided not to understand. One elder said I was afraid and inventing reasons to explain my fear. Another said I was ungrateful for Duro's blessings. I walked out of the council hall into the afternoon light and stood still for a long time. Emre was waiting for me outside. He could not meet my eyes. That night, Duro performed what he called a full cleansing ritual for the village. He built a fire in the center square using wood he had brought himself from the bush. He burned dry herbs and roots over the flames, and the smoke that rose from it had a strange sweet smell that drifted across the entire village on the evening breeze. He chanted in a language none of us recognized and shook a rattle made of dry seeds in slow, sweeping arcs around the perimeter of the square. People sat around the fire and watched him with the quiet reverence they usually reserved for festival nights. Children were brought out wrapped in blankets. The elders sat in their chairs with their hands folded. The chief watched with approval on his face. The ritual lasted nearly 2 hours. Afterward, the village was quiet. The strange sounds that had been coming from the forest edge at night, those low, rhythmic movements that nobody had been able to explain, stopped completely. The air felt still and settled. Even I noticed it. People slept well that night, deeply and without trouble. In the morning, everyone said the ritual had worked. By the following night, a second sacred goat had disappeared from the shrine. Yawa discovered it at dawn and said nothing for several minutes. He just stood in front of the empty rope and shook his head slowly like a man watching something inevitable arrive. The hunters found the footprints on the third morning after the second goat disappeared. 3 men had gone out before sunrise to check their traps along the northern edge of the bush. They came back before the morning meal with their faces tight and their voices carefully controlled. The way men speak when they have seen something they are not sure how to explain. The prints were in the soft mud along the stream bank. They were shaped like human feet, 5 toes, a heel, an arch. But they were longer than any man's foot in the village, and pressed so deep into the earth that whatever made them weighed considerably more than a person. The stride between each print was too wide. A man would have to jump to cover that distance in one step. They led from the stream bank toward the jungle. And then the trail turned. The prints did not continue into the forest. They curved back toward the village and ended at the base of the shrine tree. The elders gathered around the prints and stood in silence for a long time. Even those who had been most dismissive of my warnings looked unsettled now. The ground did not lie. You could not argue with mud. Chief Abora asked Duro what this meant. Duro crouched beside the prints, studied them, and stood. He said the forest spirits had already come to look at what belonged to them. He said the village was running out of time. On the 7th day after the second goat disappeared, Duro addressed the full village. Chief Abora had called a gathering at the central square, and nearly everyone came. Farmers, fishermen, mothers with children on their backs, hunters, the elderly sitting in the front on low stools. I stood near the back, my bandaged hand at my side, watching. Duro stood in the center and spoke slowly, pausing often to let his words settle. He said the forest spirits had been patient but were patient no longer. He said the charms and the rituals and the cleansing smoke had delayed things, but delay was no longer enough. The goats had been taken as warning. The footprints were a message. The dreams the children were having were invitations. The spirits were already learning the faces of the village. He said there was only one thing that would satisfy them fully. The square went completely quiet. He said the old ways required a human offering, one person, sent willingly into the forest of no return, to carry the village's sins into the jungle and give the spirits something that was owed to them. He said it did not have to be anyone valuable. It could be someone who had already troubled the balance. His eyes moved across the square. They came to rest on me, not for long, just a moment, just enough. I felt the shift in the crowd the way you feel rain before it falls. The verdict came before sundown. Chief Abora did not look at me when he announced it. He stood in front of the council bench with his staff in both hands and his eyes fixed somewhere above my head, at a point on the back wall that did not exist. He said the council had deliberated. He said the decision was not made lightly. He said the village had to be protected and one man's discomfort could not outweigh the safety of everyone. He used the word discomfort. He called being sent alive into the jungle of sacrifice a discomfort. I stood in the center of the floor and listened. I did not argue. What would be the point? Argument required a listener, and no one in that room was listening anymore. They had already made up their minds. Duro had made it up for them, slowly, carefully, over weeks of charms and blessings and quiet suggestions. By the time they voted, they thought they were deciding freely. I accepted without a word. Outside afterward, Emre found me. He stood in front of me and his eyes were red. He opened his mouth twice and closed it both times. He grabbed my arm and held it. His grip was tight. He finally said, "Kofi, I'm sorry." I patted his hand with my good one. "It's all good," I told him. "It's all good." He turned away quickly so I would not see his face. They walked me to the boundary of the sacred forest the next morning at dawn. 8 men escorted me. 4 village guards and 4 elders, one of whom carried a calabash of ritual water and a smoking bundle of dried leaves. They walked behind me rather than beside me, the way you walk behind something you do not want to look at directly. I walked with my hands bound loosely in front of me. The binding was more ceremonial than practical. Everyone knew I was not going to run. Running would have confirmed their story about me. And somewhere, deeper than fear, I believed that if truth existed at all, It would not let me die here for a lie. At the boundary stone, a wide flat rock carved with the village's founding marks, the eldest elder poured the ritual water over the ground and spoke the words of sending. He told the spirits I came freely. I almost laughed. Then the guards cut the binding from my wrists, pushed me past the stone, and stepped back. I stood on the other side of the boundary, in the shadow of the first trees, and turned to look back at the village. A dozen people had gathered to watch from a distance. I saw Duro standing among them at the back. He was watching me with those calm, careful eyes. I turned and walked into the jungle. The forest fell immediately, completely silent. I had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when they found me. I heard them before I saw them. Not footsteps exactly, more like the forest rearranging itself around me, the way water shifts when something large moves beneath the surface. Branches moved without wind. The undergrowth on both sides of the path compressed slowly. The birds, what few remained this deep in the jungle, stopped. Then they stepped out. There were 6 of them, surrounding me in a loose circle so that I had nowhere to move. They were tall, taller than any man I had ever stood beside, with broad sloping shoulders and long arms that hung nearly to their knees. They walked fully upright, and they wore cloth strips around their waists and crude sandals on their feet. Their faces were covered with woven masks. I stood still. One of them stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. Not roughly, more the way a farmer steers an animal he does not want to frighten. They wanted me calm. That told me something. They were not killing me here. They guided me forward through the jungle in single file. I walked. I kept my breathing even. I thought about what I knew and what I did not know and what that gap between them might mean. They did not bind my hands. They did not hurt me. They simply walked me deeper into the trees. They brought me to a clearing where a fire burned in a shallow pit at the center. Around the edges of the clearing stood structures built from thick branches and broad leaves. Not rough shelters but deliberate buildings, arranged in a pattern with pathways between them. This was not a temporary camp. This was a place people, or something like people, had lived in for a long time. Other figures moved between the structures. Some tended the fire. Others ground something between flat stones. They moved with the calm efficiency of a village going about its daily business, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing I had witnessed so far. 2 of them guided me to a low structure at the clearing's eastern edge and seated me on a mat. A third brought a wooden bowl filled with thick, warm food, something like a stew smelling of herbs and root vegetables. They set it in front of me and waited. I understood then. They were feeding me, washing me, anointing me, the same way a village prepares an animal before a festival. I was not a guest. I was not a prisoner to be interrogated or tortured. I was being prepared, maintained, kept in good condition for a specific purpose. I was an offering. The drums started shortly after that, low and patient, from the far side of the clearing. I set down the bowl and clasped my hands together and breathed. While they bathed and prepared me, I looked around the clearing carefully. The sacred tree stood at the northern edge. I could see it from where I sat. It was enormous, older than anything I had seen in the outer jungle, with roots that rose out of the ground like kneeling figures and bark so thick and deeply ridged that it looked like a living wall. Ropes had been attached to it at about shoulder height, knotted into loops. Carved into the bark were symbols. I recognized them immediately. They were the same symbols that had been burned into the dead goat's skin near the forest edge. The same careful circles inside circles, the same angled lines cutting across them in a pattern that was too deliberate to be accidental. I had memorized those markings the morning I found them because something in my chest told me they mattered. They were here, on this tree, cut deep into the bark over what looked like many years, some of the oldest ones faded and smoothed by weather. This was not new. This had been happening for a long time. I thought about all the years before Duro arrived, all the disappearances that had gone unexplained, the travelers who had simply never returned, the villagers who had been sent away for various reasons and vanished. My blood went cold. Someone had been bringing them here. The ape priest arrived at the clearing near dusk. He was different from the others in every way that mattered. He moved differently, slower, more deliberate, with the weight of authority in every step. He was taller than the guards who had brought me, and he wore a long cloth wrapped from waist to ankle that moved around his feet as he walked. His mask was not woven bark like the others but carved wood, painted in 3 colors, red, white, and the deep black of charred bone. He was followed by 2 attendants who carried a smoking vessel between them on a wooden frame. But what stopped my breath was what hung around his neck. A charm. Twisted cord wrapped in a specific pattern around a small bundle of dry material, sealed with something dark and waxy. The knot work was complex and distinctive. I knew that charm. I had seen it dozens of times over the past weeks, sold and given freely to the villagers of my home. The same twisted cord. The same pattern. The same sealed knot. Duro's charm. I stared at it while the priest took his position beside the sacred tree, and the attendants arranged the smoking vessel at the base of the roots. My mind moved through the facts like a man testing ice. Each step careful, each connection checked before putting weight on it. The charm was the link. Duro and this priest were connected. The ritual began. They brought me to the tree as the last light left the sky. 4 of the tall figures walked me across the clearing with one hand each placed on my shoulders and arms, not forcefully but firmly, guiding me toward the trunk. The drums that had been rolling in the background since evening grew louder. More of the figures had gathered at the edges of the clearing. I counted nearly 20, standing in the shadows between the structures, watching. The priest stood waiting at the tree. He held a carved wooden staff in one hand, and the smoking vessel was now positioned directly before the roots. The smell of the smoke was that same sweet, thick scent from Duro's cleansing ritual back in the village. My stomach turned. They pressed my back against the bark and began securing my wrists in the rope loops. I let them. I breathed slowly. I watched the priest's face behind his wooden mask and told myself to think, not to panic. To keep observing because observation was the only weapon I had left. The priest stepped toward me. He raised his staff and the drums hit a single deep note and fell silent all at once. He began the inspection, starting from my face, moving to my neck, my shoulders, my arms. His eyes moved slowly and methodically like a man reading a document he knows by heart. I stood still and let his gaze travel. Then he reached my hands. He lifted my left hand. He stared at the wrapped bandage where my thumb used to be. The clearing went absolutely silent. The priest lowered my hand slowly and stepped back. He turned to the figures nearest him and made a low, sharp sound. Not a word exactly, more like a signal. An argument broke out immediately. 3 of the tall figures stepped forward and began what looked like a heated discussion with the priest, gesturing toward me, toward the tree, toward the jungle beyond the clearing. I stood bound to the tree and watched and waited. The priest held firm. He kept making the same gesture, one open hand held palm up, then swept to the side. Again and again, a definitive motion. Rejection. I understood, slowly and with a strange, spreading relief, what was happening. Whatever their ritual required, it required a whole and perfect offering. No missing pieces, no incomplete body. The ancient rules of their sacrifice demanded that the human given to this ceremony arrive unmarked and intact. No wounds, no absences, nothing taken. My left thumb was gone, and that missing piece made me wrong for this purpose. Defective. Unusable. They could not sacrifice me. The ropes were cut from my wrists. Not gently. The figures yanked them loose with something that felt like frustration and pushed me hard away from the tree. I stumbled and caught myself on a root. Then 2 of them grabbed my arms and marched me to the edge of the clearing. They pointed into the dark jungle toward the direction of my village. They released me. I walked. I reached the village boundary 3 days later. I had moved slowly through the jungle, resting during the hottest parts of the day and walking in the cool hours. I ate what I knew was safe, fruits I recognized, water from streams that ran clear. I had grown up near this forest. I knew its edges, even if I had never gone so deep before. When I crossed the boundary stone, the first person to see me was a young boy carrying water from the well. He dropped the calabash and ran. By the time I reached the central square, a crowd had gathered. They stood back from me the way people stand back from something they have decided to be afraid of. The whispers moved through them in waves. A woman covered her child's eyes. Chief Abora was brought from his compound. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. He looked the way a man looks when he has done something he cannot undo and now has to live in the same room with the result. He finally said, "Kofi." I said, "Chief." He said, "How?" I looked at him steadily. I was tired and thin and my hand ached in its wrapping and I had not slept properly in 3 days. But I was clear. I had been clear every moment since the priest stepped back from me at the tree. I said, "I need to see Duro." The crowd shifted. Duro was brought to the square within the hour. He came without resistance. He walked with that same easy, unhurried step he always had, his satchel on his shoulder, his face composed and pleasant. He looked at me standing alive in the center of the square with what appeared to be mild surprise, the kind a man shows when he sees a neighbor he expected to be traveling and finds instead standing in the market. He greeted me warmly. He called me by name. He said he was relieved I had returned safely. He said the ancestors must have protected me because my heart was pure. I waited until he finished. Then I described the priest. I described the clearing, the sacred tree with its carvings, the preparation ritual, the inspection. I described it all in plain, specific language with no additions and no exaggerations. The square was completely quiet. Then I described the charm around the priest's neck. I told the chief and every person standing there exactly what it looked like. The twisted cord, the sealed knot, the pattern. And I asked them to compare what I described to the charms that Duro had been distributing to our village for weeks. Murmurs started immediately. People began looking at the charms on their own wrists. Duro's pleasant expression did not quite break. But something shifted behind his eyes. Something that had been perfectly still moved, just slightly. He said it was a common design, old and widely known. He denied everything. I had saved the most important part for last. I told them about the materials. When the priest came close to me during the inspection, the smoking vessel had been open and close enough that I could see inside it partially. The material burning in it was not wood or root or dried herb. It was composed of things I recognized only because of what I had seen and touched in ordinary life. Small bones, compressed, dried matter, ground remains. Then I told them about what Duro had asked for at the village gate the day Emre shot off my thumb. My severed thumb. I asked the crowd to remember that moment. Several of them had been present. I asked them to remember how quickly Duro had appeared, how specifically he had asked for the piece, how he had framed it as a healing remedy. I asked them to think about what the charms sold throughout our village might actually contain. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of skepticism, the silence of comprehension arriving like cold water. Duro moved before the questions came. He turned smoothly and began walking toward the edge of the square, his satchel gripped tightly, his pace controlled but fast. He had almost reached the lane between the market stalls when the hunters blocked his path. For hunters stepped into the lane from both sides before Duro could choose a direction. He stopped. He stood with his satchel hugged against his chest and looked at the hunters, then back at the chief, then at the crowd pressing in behind him. He stood very still for a moment and I watched the calculation happen in his face, the assessment of exits, of options, of whether anything remained that could save his position. Nothing did. Chief Abora crossed the square and stood directly in front of him. He said one word, "Speak." Duro lowered his head. What came out over the next hour, drawn out question by question, was this. The ape tribe in the deep jungle had an ancient system. They required periodic human sacrifice, whole, perfect people, to sustain rituals that he claimed protected their community and maintained the balance of the deep forest. He had made contact with them years ago, before he came to us, learning their requirements and their language in exchange for knowledge of their herbal remedies. He had brought those remedies to villages across the region for years. The blessings were real, he had used genuine knowledge. But the price was real too. Each village that welcomed him eventually provided a human for the tribe. The charms made with their materials worked partly because of what was in them. The prosperity was bait. He had targeted me specifically because I was the one most likely to cause problems. The chief's face showed nothing while he listened. When Duro finished, the square was silent for a long time. Not for me to tell. What I can tell you is what happened in the days after. The charms were collected from every person in the village and burned in a fire that Yahweh, the old shrine keeper, built and tended himself. The burning took the better part of a day. He insisted on doing it properly, with the right prayers and the right ritual cleanings, so that whatever was inside those bundles left the village properly and did not linger. We let him do it at his own pace. The livestock that had recovered under Duro's care remained healthy. The harvests were good. This was difficult for some people to process, that something real could exist alongside something corrupt. But that is how the deepest deceptions work. The gift has to be genuine or nobody accepts it. Several of the elders came to me privately in the weeks that followed. None of them said the word apology directly. But they sat with me, and they stayed longer than was necessary, and when they left they gripped my shoulder the way men do when words do not reach the place they need to go. Emre visited every day for a month. He never stopped looking at my left hand. I always told him the same thing I told him the morning the arrow flew wrong and the blood came, and none of us knew yet what that moment would mean. It's all good. One morning near the end of the rainy season, I stood at the village boundary stone and raised my left hand and looked at where the thumb used to be. I thought about the priest stepping back, about the ropes falling loose, about walking out of that clearing alive because I was incomplete in a way that made me useless to them. I thought about how Emre's hands shook the morning he realized what he had done. I thought about how gently the ancestors sometimes break us open to save us. I lowered my hand and turned back toward the village. If only they knew the day my friend shot off my thumb was the day my life was saved. Not every wound is meant to destroy you. Some are given so that you may live.